Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. In this video, we are going to take a detailed look at Python list comprehensions with if and else conditions. If you have worked with Python, you have probably written a normal for loop to create a new list from an existing list. Python gives a much easier, shorter and cleaner way of doing that, which is called a list comprehension. There is one part that can be little confusing, especially when we start using conditions. Where exactly should the if go? And what happens when we want to use if else? So in this video, we'll start with the basic list comprehension, then we'll see how to use if, how to use if else, multiple conditions, and even nested list comprehensions. We'll also look at the practical examples, common mistakes, and finally compares list comprehension with traditional for loop. So that by the end of this video, you should have clear understanding of not only how list comprehension works, but also when and how to use conditions with that. Let's start with basic concept, which is list comprehension. If you are working with Python, you will often come across the situation where you already have a list and you want to create another list. For example, maybe you have a list of numbers and you want to create a new list containing the squares of those numbers. Normally, we would use a for loop for this, but Python provides us with a much shorter way of doing the same thing. And that's what we call list comprehension. The main advantage here is that instead of writing several lines of code, we can actually accomplish the same task in single line. For example, if you want to create a list containing squares of numbers from 1 to 5 with a traditional loop, I would create an empty list, loop through the numbers, calculate the square, and then append each result. With list comprehension, all of that can be written in one line. So, the basic idea is very simple. Takes value from iterable, performs some operation on them, and create a new list. Now, why would we actually use list comprehension? The first reason is a concise syntax. It allows us to reduce several lines of code into much shorter expression. The second is readability. Once you are familiar with the syntax, you can look at a list comprehension and immediately understand what list is being created. Another benefit is that list comprehension are generally efficient for these kinds of list building operations, and they are also quite flexible. We can use conditions and we can even work with nested loops when we need to. So you can think of a list comprehension as more compact way of creating a new list from an existing iterable. One important thing is that shorter code doesn't automatically mean better code. If a list comprehension becomes too complicated, a normal for loop can actually be easier to understand. So, for now, just remember the basic idea. List comprehension lets us to create new list in a concise and Pythonic way. Now we understood what list comprehension is. Let's see how we can add an if condition to it. This is especially useful when we doesn't want every item from our original list. Instead, we want to filter the items based on some condition. For example, imagine I have a list containing numbers from 1 to 10, but I only want the even numbers. With a normal for loop, I would go through each number, check whether the number is even, and only then add it to my new list. List comprehension allow us to put that condition directly into the expression. The general syntax looks like expression for item in iterable if condition. The important thing to notice here is the position of if. We first specify what we want to put into a new list. Then we specify for loop. Then after we put if condition. So in this case, the if is mainly being used for filtering. If the condition is true, the item is included in the new list. If it's false, the item is simply skipped. Let's see an example for this. I'll copy paste the code and I'll explain each term of this. Taken a simple example, here I've created a list called numbers, which contains the values from 1 to 10. Now, I want to get only the even numbers from this list. So I'm creating another variable called even numbers. And this is where I'm using the list comprehension. Let's break it down. N represents each numbers from the original list. Then we have for n in numbers, which means we are going through values inside numbers list. And finally we have n modulo operator to double equals to 0. The modulo operator here gives us the remainder. So when a number is divided by 2, if the remainder is 0, we know that it's an even number. Only those numbers that satisfies this condition will be added. Even numbers variable. I'll run this code. You can see we'll get 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10. We don't get odd numbers because the condition n modulo 2 double equals to 0 is false for those values. So they are simply skipped. This is the key idea behind using if with list comprehension. We are filtering the original list and we have created new list containing only the values that meet our condition. Now we have seen how we can use an if condition with list comprehension to filter the items. But what if we don't want to simply include or exclude an item? What if we want to do one thing when a condition is true and something else when the condition is false? That's where if else comes in. With if alone, we are basically asking should this item be included in the new list? But with if else, we are asking a slightly different question like what value should I put into the new list depending on the condition? So we are making a decision for every item. So the syntax looks like expression if true, if condition, else, expression if false for item and iterable. Now there is one thing I want you to pay attention because this is where beginners often get confused. With an if only list comprehension, the if comes after for. But when we use if else, the if else part comes before the for because it's actually the expression that determines what goes into our new list. So if the condition is true, we'll get one value. If it's false, we'll get another value. Let's make this much clearer with an example. Here I've got a list of numbers from 1 to 10 and what I want to do is to create a new list where every number is categorized as either even or odd. So I've created a variable called result and inside the list comprehension I'm checking each number one by one. The condition is n modulo 2 double equals to 0. If this condition is true, which means if the number is divisible by 2, we are going to put the word even into our new list. Otherwise, the else part is executed and we put odd into the list. So, for example, when n is 1, 1, comma 1 modulo 2, it's not 0. So, the condition is false and we would get odd. Then when n is 2, the remainder will be 0. So that condition will become true and we get even. And this continues for every number in our original list. If I run this code, you can see that the output contains 10 values just like our original list. For 1 we get odd, for 2 we get even, for 3 we get odd and for 4 we'll get even and this continues to all the 10 numbers. Notice that we are not filtering anything out here. Every number gets a corresponding value in the new list. That's the important difference between using if and using if else in list comprehension. With if, we can filter items, but if else, we are deciding what value should be produced for each item. So, whenever you need to choose between two possible values based on a condition, if else is a useful option inside list comprehension. Let's clear up one of the most common point of confusion with list comprehension. The difference between using if and using if else. Both are useful, but they serve different purposes. When we use just an if, we are normally filtering the original list. In other words, some items make it into new list and some items won't. For example, if I have 10 numbers, I use an if condition to select only even numbers, I might end up with the only 5 numbers. So the new list can be shorter than the original list with if else. That's the difference. We are not filtering out the items. Instead, we are deciding what values to produce for each item. So, if I then start with 10 numbers, I'll normally end up with 10 results. That's probably easier way to remember the difference. If means filter, if else means transform or choose a value. There's also a difference where we place the condition. For an if, only comprehension. Let's see an example for this. Here I've used the same list of numbers for both examples so that we can clearly see the difference. First I'm using just if n for n in numbers, if n modulo 2 double equals to 0. Here I'm saying give me the numbers only if they are even. So the odd numbers are completely left out. Then the second example, I'm using if else, even if n modulo 2 double equals to 0, else odd for n in numbers. This time I'm saying for every number, give me the word even if it's even number. Otherwise, give me odd. So this time nothing is removed. Every number gets a result, either odd or even. Now, if I run this code, you can see the difference become clear. The original list contains 5 numbers. When we use if, the output is 2 and 4. We only wanted even numbers, so other values are filtered out. That's why the result is very short. But when we used if else, the result is 5 numbers because we are processing every number. Each number is converted into either odd or even. So if you are trying to select only certain items, use if. If you are trying to assign or transform every element based on a condition, use if else. That's the simple rule I would remember. Before we move on, let's take a quick look at the practical Python project that uses this concept in real application. A speech to text converter using Python. This application allows user to convert spoken audio into readable text through a simple graphical interface. You can either upload a existing audio file or record your voice directly using microphone. Once the audio is provided, the application processes the speech using Python's speech recognition capabilities and it converts the spoken words into text. The generated text is then automatically displayed in the application window where you can review it and make use of it as needed. The application also allow you to save the converted text, which can be useful when you want to keep a transcript for future reference. This kind of tool can be useful for several real world tasks such as creating transcript, taking voice notes, converting interviews, or recorded conversations into text and make spoken content easier to access. So this project gives you a good example of how Python can be used beyond simple programs to build practical applications that work with speech and audio. You can also download the complete speech to text converter and try the application yourself. I'll be giving the link in the description box where you can download the full source code. Now let's continue with our video and move to next topic. We know that how to use single if condition in list comprehension and we have also seen how if else works. But in real programs, sometimes one condition isn't enough. For example, imagine you have a list of numbers and you want to select a number that are greater than 10 and also even. Now, I have to check two things at the same time here. This is where we can use multiple conditions in list comprehension. Python allows us combine conditions using operators such as and, or, and, not. With and, both conditions must be true. With or, at least one condition must be true. And with not, we can basically reverse the condition or exclude values that meet a particular condition. So instead of creating several separate if statements, we can combine our conditions directly inside the list comprehension. The general idea looks like this. Expression for item in iterable. If condition 1 and or are not values and condition 2. The useful thing about this is that we can make our filtering much more precise. Let's take a simple example where we want to find the numbers that are both greater than 10 and even. Here I have a list containing different numbers. Now I want to create a new list, but I only want numbers that satisfies two conditions. The first condition is n greater than 10, then I'm using, which means second condition also must be true. The second condition is n modulus 2 double equals to 0. This checks whether the number is even. So for a number to be included in our result, it has to pass both. For example, 12 is greater than 10 and it's also even. It gets included. 15 is greater than 10 but it's not even. So it gets skipped. And 8 is even but it's not greater than 10. So that gets skipped as well. When I run this code, we'll get 12, 18, 24 and 30. And if we look at each of these values, they'll satisfy both the conditions. They are greater than 10 as well as their even numbers. The main advantage of using multiple conditions in list comprehension is we can be much more specific about which items we want. So whenever you need to filter data based on more than one requirement, you can combine conditions using and or not. Now, let's look at the nested list comprehension with if else. As the name suggests, here we are using one list comprehension inside another list comprehension. This is useful when we are working with nested list, where we have a list containing other list. Along with the nested structure, we can also use if else to apply a condition to each individual value. So we have an outer comprehension that goes through the inner list and an inner comprehension that processes the values inside each list. Let's understand this with an example. Here we have a nested list containing two lists. The outer part goes through each rows in number and the inner list comprehension goes through each value in that. For every value, we are checking whether it's even or odd. If the number is divisible by 2, we got even, otherwise we get odd. So the inner comprehension handles the individual values while the outer comprehension handles the nested list. Here you can see I've written the conditions to do that. I'll run this code. As you can see in the output, each number has been converted into either even or odd, while the nested list structure is maintained over here. So, this is how we can combine the nested list comprehension with if else to process values inside the nested list. Now, let's take what we have learned about list comprehension and see how they can actually be useful in the real world situations. List comprehensions aren't just something we can use to make a piece of Python code. They can be really useful when we are working with the data and we want to filter, transform, or extract information in a clean way. For example, imagine we have a list of users. Each user has some information like their name, email, role, and whether they are currently active. Now, suppose our requirement is that we only want the email address of users who are active and whose role is either admin or manager. This is a good situation for a list comprehension because we are filtering the users based on multiple conditions and then extracting only the information we actually need. Let's see this in VS Code. Here we have four users, and each user has details like their name, email, role, and whether they are active or not. In this list comprehension, we go through each user and checks two conditions. First is the user should be active, and the second is the role should be either admin or manager. If both conditions are satisfied, we take only the user's email address, So instead of keeping the complete user details, we are filtering the users and extracting the only email we need. If I run this code, we get these two email address. Alice is active and has admin role, so her email is included. Bob is active but his role is user, so he didn't meet the role condition. Charlie has the manager role but he is not active, so he is excluded. David is active and has admin role, so his email ID is included. That's why the final result contains Alice and David email address. This is a good example of how list comprehension can make a real world data processing shorter and cleaner. Now let's talk about some common mistakes that can happen when working with list comprehensions. The first mistake is forgetting the iterable after the for keyword. We need to satisfy what we are going to iterate over. If we forget the iterable, Python will give us syntax error. So we need to make sure that our list comprehension has proper structure including the iterable after for. The second mistake is missing colon in an if else expression. When we are using if else inside the list comprehension, the syntax need to be correct. If the colon is missing, Python will report an error. The third mistake is using append instead of comprehension. We can certainly use a loop for append function, but when the operation can be expressed clearly using the list comprehension, the comprehension can make code shorter and more readable. Fourth mistake is unnecessary complexity. This is an important one. Just because Python allows us to put a lot of logic into the one list comprehension doesn't mean we should. If a comprehension becomes overly complicated and difficult to read or debug, it's better to keep the code simple. The goal isn't to create a cleverest one liner possible. The goal is to write the code that is cleaner and easy to understand. The fifth mistake is not handling empty cases. We should make sure that our list comprehension works properly even when the input list is empty. Otherwise, depending on how we are accessing the data, we may run into errors such as index error. So, these are the main mistakes to keep in mind. Don't forget the iterables. Use the correct if else syntax. Avoid unnecessary use of append function. Don't make comprehensions over complex. And make sure empty cases are handled properly. And finally, the best practice from this section is very simple. Keep your list comprehension simple, readable. Clarity is more important. Now, let's compare list comprehension with a traditional for loop. Both approaches can be used to create list in Python, but they have some important difference. The first difference is syntax. List comprehension gives us a shorter and more concise way to create list, while the traditional for loop usually requires more lines of code. Next is readability. For simple operations, list comprehension is generally easier to read and understand because we can see the whole operation in one place. A traditional for loop can be more verbose because we have separate lines for creating list, looping through items, checking conditions, and adding the result. When it comes to performance, list comprehensions are generally faster and more optimized for these types of list creation operations, while a traditional for loop can be slightly slower because it involves more steps. But that doesn't mean that list comprehension should always be used. List comprehension is ideal when the operation is simple to moderately complex. A traditional for loop can be a better choice when we use complex logic, multiple operations, or when we need more control and easier debugging. So, the main idea is use list comprehension when you want clean, concise, and efficient code, and the logic is simple. Use a traditional for loop when you need more control or you're dealing with more complex operations. Let's say this difference is clearly with an example. Here, we are doing exactly the same task in both the cases. With the list comprehension, everything is written in single line. We are going through numbers, checking whether each number is even and then calculating its square. With the traditional for loop, we first create an empty squares list Then we go through each number checking the condition and use of append function to add square to a list. So both approaches gives us the same result, but the list comprehension is much shorter and concise for this particular operation. If I run this code, the output is same for both the approaches. These are squares of even numbers from our original list. So this example clearly shows why list comprehension is useful for simple list creation task. It reduces the amount of code while keeping the operation easy to understand. So that brings us to the end of this video, Python list comprehension with else if. We started with basic of list comprehension and then we learned how to use if to filter items from a list. Next, we saw how if else allowed us to choose different values based on conditions. And we also looked the difference between if and if else. We then covered multiple conditions, nested list comprehensions, and real world examples to understand how these concepts can be used in practical situations. Finally, we discussed some common mistakes and the importance of keeping the list comprehension simple. I hope this video helped you to understand Python list comprehension with if else clearly. Thank you for watching this video. We'll see you in the next video.